Story 1. The Unseen Stalker. Last year, a buddy and I set out for a familiar camping spot, a place we'd come to know well over many years, and many trips. It's a secluded spot, tucked away from civilization and all the noise that comes with it. Typically, we hardly ever encounter other people there, and if we do, they're generally far from our campsite. When we arrived, we set up camp and went through our usual routine. We took a quick scope of the area, had a few beers around the fire, and some easy conversation under the stars. On this trip, there wasn't a soul in sight. We had the campsite all to ourselves. No distant lights, no crackling campfires in the distance, just us and the mountain. It was nice, but at the same time, somewhat eerie. After dinner, we settled into our tents. It was a hot night, so we left our tents unzipped with only the mesh to keep the bugs out and let the breeze in. My dog was with me, and he was usually the most laid-back creature you'd ever meet. But on this trip, he refused to settle down. He was restless, and his ears perked up as he kept pressing his nose against the mesh. Something had his attention. Thinking it was maybe a raccoon or some other curious critter, I got up to check it out, but the camp was quiet, almost too quiet. The woods seemed to absorb sound, and the darkness felt like it was closing in around us. This trip seemed completely different from previous ones, and it felt like something was definitely off. I returned to the fire, thinking that whatever it was would eventually go away, but my dog became even more irritated. His hackles raised, and he let off a low, menacing growl as he stared off into the woods. Eventually, my buddy stepped out of his tent too, curious about the commotion. "What's up with your dog?" he asked. "I'm not sure," I replied. "Something in the woods has him spooked." "Probably just a critter," my buddy suggested. "I don't think so," I said. "There's something else out there." Armed with a hunting knife and an axe, we stood by the fire, scanning the woods and straining to hear anything. It seemed endless, and my dog was relentless in a way that I'd never seen him before. He snarled and whimpered, and his gaze locked onto the woods. Suddenly, a light breeze drifted from the direction of the trees, carrying with it a foul, nauseating stench unlike anything we had ever smelled before. It was so overpowering that it nearly brought tears to our eyes. Overcome by the putrid odor, my dog finally reached his limit. He dashed back to the tent and continued to whimper uncontrollably. We decided to switch on the truck lights to illuminate the camp. The sudden burst of light brought some comfort, but it revealed nothing unusual. For around 15 minutes we left the lights on, listening and scanning the woods, but there was nothing. Even the foul stench seemed to have vanished. Finally, convincing ourselves that whatever it was had moved on, we decided to turn the lights off and try to get some sleep. As I approached the truck, a horrific scream echoed from the woods. It was primal, piercing, and left no doubt that it was meant for us. Instinctively, my buddy scooped up my dog, and we both sprinted to the truck. Inside, all three of us were trembling with fear. "What the hell was that?" my buddy asked. "I don't know," I replied. "I've never heard anything like that before." Neither of us had any idea what to do or what we were dealing with. After a moment, I cracked a window to see if I could hear anything outside. As soon as I did, a low, almost demonic growl rumbled from the woods. That was the final straw. Without a word, I started up the truck and we sped away, tires spinning in the gravel. We left everything behind, the tents, chairs, coolers, and whatever else we'd brought along. We didn't look back. The next day, I told my parents what happened, but they laughed it off, called us chickens, mocked us for being scared. But we knew better. There was something out there, something that had been watching us for who knows how long. And it wasn't leaving. It's easy to be brave when you're safe at home, but when you're in the middle of nowhere, with only a hunting knife and an axe, there's a fine line between courage and common sense. Eventually, we cautiously made our way back to collect our belongings during the day. Although the campsite looked undisturbed, we didn't want to linger any longer than necessary. We quickly gathered our gear, then left and never returned. Whatever had stalked us that night was no ordinary forest critter. It was something else entirely. We'll likely never know exactly what it was, but, to be honest, I don't think either of us really wants to know. Story 2. Friend or Foe. It started out as just another camping trip. Me and my friends, Mark, Lisa, and Tom, packed up our gear and headed to the woods, ready for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and ghost stories by the fire. I remember the air being crisp and cool, and the forest being alive with the distant calls of owls. We were all in high spirits, ready for a weekend of fun. The first night was perfect. We roasted marshmallows, told stories, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. But all that changed the next day when we met a stranger. He appeared out of nowhere, a tall man with a bushy beard and a tattered flannel shirt. He seemed friendly enough at first, offering tips on the best fishing spots and warning us about a storm that was supposed to roll in later that night. We thanked him, and he went on his way, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he'd appeared. We didn't think much of it. The forest was full of hikers and woodsmen. It wasn't unusual to run into someone now and then, but as we explored the surrounding woods, we found a small clearing with a makeshift campsite. No tents, just a fire pit and some empty beer cans. There were signs that someone had been there recently. Fresh footprints in the mud, a pile of kindling stacked neatly by the fire pit, and the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. We shrugged it off, assuming someone had passed through earlier that morning. But as we walked back to our campsite, I noticed something strange. There, on a log to the side of the trail, clearly visible, was an old pocket knife I'd left at the campsite. I was sure that I had left it there, even more certain that I hadn't placed it on the log on our way in. It was positioned deliberately, the blade open, pointing back towards the way we had come. It seemed like a clear message. Someone had been in our campsite while we were gone, and that someone was watching us. I showed the others, and they tried to dismiss it, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. That night, as my friends and I sat by the fire, they laughed, joked, and had a good time. But I kept my eyes focused on the forest around us. Something felt off, like a chill creeping through the trees, and I seemed to be the only one who noticed. Their voices were warm and carefree, but my gaze remained locked on the shadows beyond the firelight, where unseen shapes seemed to shift and move, almost as if waiting for us to drop our guard. The next morning, we found more signs that we weren't alone. Fresh footprints surrounded our tents, and a bundle of sticks was arranged in a crude symbol. It was then that my friends began to take the possibility of another presence more seriously. We recalled the woodsman, the way he seemed to know these woods like the back of his hand, and his warning about the storm that never came. Lisa suggested we leave, but Mark and Tom were determined to stay, convinced that we were overreacting. I wanted to leave too, but I didn't want to abandon my friends. So we stayed, trying to keep our spirits up, but there was definitely an undercurrent of dread in the air. That night, I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, but grew louder and closer. I held my breath, listening as they circled our campsite. Slowly, I unzipped a flap from my tent window and peered into the woods. At first there was nothing, but fear gripped me when I finally saw him, standing in the shadows just beyond the light of the dying fire. It was the woodsman. He was watching us, his eyes reflecting the flames. He didn't move. He just stood there, as if he were waiting for something. I nudged the others awake, and we grabbed our flashlights, shining them into the darkness. But by then, he was gone. We searched the woods, our voices echoing through the trees, but we found nothing. Just the whisper of the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning we packed up and left. The trip was over. We didn't talk much on the way back, each lost in our thoughts. But one thing was clear to me. We were never going back to those woods. They say the scariest thing in the woods is other people, and unfortunately we found out the hard way that this saying is painfully true. Story 3. The Horror Show. We'd been on the road all day, winding through the Pacific Northwest, headed north from San Francisco toward Portland. My girlfriend Sarah and I had this great idea to camp at different sites every night along the way. We'd rented a car, packed our gear, and were ready for the ultimate adventure. But as the sun set and the sky darkened, things started to get a little weird. Our first campsite turned out to be closed for the season. This was after their website said they were open, so we were bummed out but not totally defeated. We figured we'd just find another spot. We drove around for a bit looking for a place to crash when we stumbled upon this forest firefighter outpost. It was just a little shack with a couple of trucks parked outside. We rolled down the window to ask the firefighter on duty if he knew of any open campsites nearby. Upon hearing the question, he gave us a puzzled look, as if to say, "You guys are really camping tonight?" Nevertheless, he told us most of the sites were closed for the season, but there were a couple of spots on his old map that might still be open. He handed us the map and wished us luck, but I swear I saw a hint of pity in his eyes. We eventually found a campsite, but it wasn't exactly welcoming. The sign was lying on the ground, half buried in weeds. By this point, however, it was so dark we could barely see where we were going, so we just pulled into a spot and hoped for the best. There were a few other tents scattered around, so we figured it was okay. We started setting up our tent and making dinner when these two guys just walked through our campsite like they owned the place. They were weird. One had a hoodie with no shirt underneath, and both were super skinny and dirty. They talked really fast, saying they were seasonal workers staying here to save money, but they seemed nervous for some reason. It was like they were hiding something. A little later on, an old white Mercedes pulled in, blasting rap music. The driver and passenger looked like they were ready for some kind of rave or something. They took one look around and bailed. At the time, I thought they were just looking for a campsite, but now I'm not so sure. After the two guys left, this older woman with a raspy voice came over. She sounded like she'd been smoking 3 packs a day for decades. She was friendly enough, but her questions were strange. "You guys here for the horror show?" she asked. I had no idea what she was talking about. Was there a haunted house nearby or something? She talked about ghouls and zombies, laughing in this creepy way that made my skin crawl. Sarah and I just kind of nodded along, figuring maybe it was some local Halloween event. It was October after all. As we started our fire, Sarah whispered that she was freaked out. She pointed out how quiet the campsite was. No laughter, no music, nothing but the occasional cough from the old woman. I told her it was probably just some harmless weirdos, but I was starting to feel uneasy too. Then things got really strange. The two guys we met earlier came out of the woods with no flashlights and walked straight into their tent. They had this heated argument, and one of them stormed out, glaring at me like he wanted to rip my head off. He got into the cab of a pickup truck where someone else was already sitting. A lighter flickered, and they started smoking something. It wasn't cigarettes, that's for sure. That's when it hit me. These guys weren't just weird, they were tweakers. Suddenly, everything made sense. The constant coughing, the strange behavior, the creepy atmosphere. We were in a drug camp. I glanced around and noticed one of the guys lurking around our campsite, trying not to be seen. That's when I knew we had to get out of there. We packed up as slowly and casually as we could, trying not to draw attention. But it didn't work. People started staring at us and we could hear muffled conversations. Just then, a rough-looking man looked to be approaching us. I told Sarah to hop in the car, and as quickly as I could, I finished packing and jumped into the car myself. As we drove off, we could hear them shouting and yelling. It was chaos. We got onto the main road and found a bed and breakfast not far away. The owner didn't ask any questions when we stumbled in, probably because we looked like we'd seen a ghost. We spent the night there, grateful to be somewhere safe and normal. I'm a pretty avid camper, and I've had my fair share of run-ins, but this night was different. It wasn't the bears or the wolves that scared me, it was the people. I can't help but think what kind of situation we might have been in if I hadn't realized what was going on and left when we did.